Welcome to the Datacolor 2013 webinar series. We're co-sponsoring this webinar with SLR Lounge, and they're a great source for various types of materials on workflow, Lightroom, Photoshop, so I encourage you to go visit there. We will actually be giving away an SLR Lounge workflow DVD set at the end of this webinar, along with a Datacolor Spider Pro. So please stick around for that. Now what we're going to do here is run a presentation on Photoshop and Lightroom workflow. I'm going to let my partner David Saffir, who I'll introduce in a second, do most of the heavy lifting on that. And what I'm going to do is answer questions. And most of the questions that I will be answering will be the ones you're typing into the chat in here. So you're going to want to organize your screen such that you can see the chat window as well as the presentation window. Once you have that set up so that you can see what's going on, then we will get the webinar started. So in the meantime, let me introduce David Saffir. He's a professional commercial photographer and fine art photographer working in Southern California. I've been doing webinars with him for quite some time. I had the honor of going out shooting with him in person the other day. In fact, the image on this introductory screen you see here is one that he shot the other day in Mission Canyon in Santa Barbara, California. So I'm going to let David take over and start this presentation in just a second once you're all in your seats and have your screen set up such that you can see the chat window, and we'll move on from there. So thank you, David, for joining us, and I'm looking forward to doing this presentation with you today.
Thanks, David. It's a really nice day here in Southern California. I hope that everybody's attending is enjoying the day. I can see that people are still loading in, so I'm going to wait just 1 minute before I begin. So everybody, if you would kindly just stand by, we'll get rolling.
Well, in the meantime, I'm going to mention this is the first time that we have partnered on a webinar with SLR Lounge. We're very pleased to be working with them. They are a great source for information, and that we're hoping that everyone who attends this webinar will swing by and take a look at what they have on their website. I think you'll find them very easy to find, and we'll hopefully see you all at Datacolor at some point in the future as well if you aren't already Datacolor customers.
That reminds me, if anybody that's attending this is going to WPPI, we're going to be there, aren't we, David?
Yes, we'll both be there personally in person, as the saying goes. And we'd love to meet any of you who are attending WPPI in Las Vegas in March. You'll find us at the Datacolor booth.
Yeah. I do want to mention a little bit more about the SLR Lounge. They're a photography tutorial blog. They have several writers and a blog, and they cover a lot of things related to photography. They have tutorials and things like that. So at the end of this session, we'll give you a link to their website. And David, don't we have a couple of prizes that we're giving away?
Yes, we have a Datacolor Spider 4 Pro that we'll be giving away at the end of this webinar, and then we have from SLR Lounge one of their workflow DVD sets that we'll be giving away. So double reasons to stick around this time.
Very cool. We'll be announcing those winners at the end of the session. Now, this webinar is the latest in actually quite a long series now of webinars that we've been doing on a variety of subjects. Today we're going to talk about workflow using Lightroom 4 and Photoshop CS6. We're going to show you a little bit about how one can leverage the strongest assets of each and go back and forth between them to get optimal results. We're hoping you'll find it to be enjoyable. It's not a tutorial about the very fine details of working with each application as much as it is at many points the view from, say, 10,000 feet, and then we're going to dive down into the weeds for a couple of minutes and then come back up to 10,000 feet and keep going. So we're going to show you key elements, and from sort of almost a global view, and then we're going to show you some of the details of selected key elements. So we're going to talk about the division of labor. By the way, this picture was taken by David Tobie. I always thought this was the alien that he met when he was running around San Luis Obispo. And it's pretty strange. It's a pretty strange looking old car, isn't it? And we're going to talk about the division of labor because you can import raw images into either application. You can process them in either application. But there's advantages to using some of the tools in Lightroom 4 over CS6 and vice versa. We'll talk a little bit about setting up the preferences panels, particularly for Lightroom, because those will drive your success in this transition back and forth between the two applications. If you get a couple of things incorrect, it starts to get a little bit harder than it should be. We'll talk a little bit about image review and selection and using some of the film strip features and the image selection features in Lightroom in particular to help you go through a day's take and make your selects and work on them effectively. We'll talk in some degree about incorporating basic metadata. I've certainly found as time has gone on that Lightroom has gotten better and better and better at allowing us to put identifier information into the image. It goes with the image, not into the image, with the image, and that allows us to do a number of things, including providing copyright protection, making the images more searchable in your own database, and if you happen to be sending images to clients in their database. We'll talk about making global color and tonal corrections, and there's some very interesting things in tonal corrections that have been changed and improved in Lightroom. And I think that they're arguably better than Photoshop in some ways. Then we'll go back to Photoshop and talk about how the use of adjustment layers can differ from using the tools in Lightroom and how you can take advantage of those. In the same vein, image transformations and perspective adjustments and some other things. A little bit about global and selective sharpening and printing. So we're going to cover a lot of territory in the next hour. Now, we do need to be selective in the session. Lightroom is feature-rich. Lightroom 4, I have to say that before Lightroom 4 came out, I wasn't the biggest fan of the application. I always thought that it was just not going to be a replacement, if you will, for Photoshop or even take over most of the things that one can do in Photoshop, but it just keeps getting better and better and better. And Photoshop does provide excellent flexibility in a lot of ways, particularly in working with layers, so why not use the best of both? But it implies a significant workflow change. A lot of people start and end in Photoshop, and another big group start and end in Lightroom, and never the two shall meet. And I don't see any reason why we can't start considering leveraging assets in both applications and using them to our advantage. I'm seeing a message here that says speak up. I'm speaking almost as loud as I can get. I'll try to do the best I can, but I'm going right into the microphone. I really have no idea why there's an audio problem. That does happen sometimes with GoToWebinar. On the other end, if you can increase your volume, please do so. Lightroom is a increasingly sophisticated raw editor, and one of the nice things about using Lightroom is that you're never getting away from editing, at least at the beginning, you're not getting away or leaving an image, a raw image, and leaving that information behind. You're working on that raw image consistently and continuously until you make a conscious decision to go to another application. And that means that you've got the most information possible at your fingertips while you're doing your adjustments and tonal corrections and things like that. Photoshop, layers, masking and compositing, head transplants, sophisticated local adjustments and corrections, etc. You can't beat Photoshop for that. And Adobe does provide tools for easily controlled transitions between these applications and tracking versions. Okay, let's get this to switch to the next. Next slide. There we go. Importing images. One of the things I want to mention, a lot of people don't do this, but I would strongly suggest, what most people do is transfer their images from a card reader, but some people do still plug their camera directly into the computer. I don't recommend that you do that. That little plug that's on the camera has a finite lifetime. It's going to wear out eventually. You're better off taking the card out of the camera, putting it in a card reader, and making your transfer. Most, but not all, RAW camera formats can be read by the Adobe RAW software engine. Just some examples: Canon, Fuji, Hasselblad, Leica, Nikon, Olympus, etc. The list keeps growing, and they keep updating it. A small number of cameras capture in Adobe's DNG format, I think to the disappointment of Adobe. Hang on a second, I'm going to take a sip of water. And as new camera models are released, they are added to the list. Now let's just stop one moment and take a quick poll. I'd like to know which application do you use most frequently for your raw image editing? So if we could just take a minute and get that information, I'd appreciate it. Okay, so just to review the results, clearly the majority of people are using Adobe Lightroom at about 70%, and about 23% are using Adobe Camera Raw. Now, regardless of whether you're in Adobe Camera Raw or Adobe Lightroom, do keep in mind that the basic software engine that's running those raw conversions is fundamentally the same. There are some features and controls that are present in Adobe Lightroom that differ, either in appearance or function from Adobe Camera Raw, but down in their guts, they're very similar. Thanks very much. Okay, let's see here. Now I want to mention something before we begin on the software side of things in detail. I want to mention that it's very important that you calibrate your display. I know that most people that are listening in today are intermediate and advanced, aspiring pros or professionals, and I know that you already know this, but it's not possible to calibrate your screen by eye. You're much better off using something like a Spider 4 Pro or Spider 4 Elite and calibrate that screen to standards so that the color, you know what you're going to get, that when you're editing your image that it's an accurate representation of the density, the dynamic range, the color, etc., etc. Now, importing images into Lightroom 4, there's quite a bit of controls here. Don't let this intimidate you. This sort of looks like an eye test to me. Because we're hooked up to a card, in this case, you can see that really there's only 2 choices that are available to you out of 4. You can copy them as DNGs. I'll come back to that in a second. You can copy them in their original raw format. And then there's 2 that are grayed out, move and add. When you're working with a card, move and add are not available for obvious reasons. If you copy them as a DNG, generally speaking, you get that raw file wrapped in a DNG wrapper. To maybe a not very elegant explanation, but that's fundamentally what happens. You get a bigger file size. Adobe would like us all to think that the DNG files are the way to go because they're quote-unquote universally applicable, and we're not going to be subject to the whims of changing standards amongst camera manufacturers and software manufacturers. But really, I haven't seen anything happen with raw files in the last several years where I had any reason to believe that I had any issues in this department. So I normally just copy the raw files as is. You can select the photos that you want to import. Generally, I select all the pictures on a camera card and bring them all in. That way I know I haven't missed anything. Sometimes I find that if I don't do that, I've missed something important. There's a lot of things that you can do to these. One of the great things about this that I think is a perfect addition to workflow is that you can copy these to a working folder, and then you can also copy them to a backup folder at the same time. And that's probably one of the most important features of this particular tool, is that you can make your backup on the fly while you're working. So, for example, if you're on location or something like that, and you want to make dead sure that you're going to go home with copies of your photos, here's the answer. And I think that's a particularly nice feature, and certainly makes it clear that Adobe does listen to photographers and does try to incorporate some of the things that we need into this software. There's a number of other things that you can do here. You can apply metadata. If you look on the right-hand side, find my cursor, right here you can apply metadata during import, and that can include keywording, that can include copyright, notifications, instructions, you name it. And of course you can, lost my place here, just give me 1 second. Okay, and of course you can put them in a destination or even into a subfolder. So it's a very versatile, flexible tool. I think this is probably one of the best import utilities that's available right now. Now here's something that's important, and I strongly urge that you pay close attention to this. If you want to be able to go back and forth between Lightroom and Photoshop, you're going to have to go to Lightroom Preferences, and you're going to see this Preferences dialog, and go to External Editing. And I suggest you change the file format to the Photoshop file format, and color space, depending on your preferences, either ProPhoto or Adobe 98. You can always go down to Adobe 98, but you can't come back to ProPhoto. So I tend to stick with ProPhoto. 16 bits at 300. Okay, and this is going to do a couple of things. It's the most important thing it's going to do is that if you're in the film strip in Lightroom and you decide that you want to open that image in Photoshop and edit it, and then you want to go back to Lightroom, having this enabled as the PSD format is going to make that much easier. In fact, I'm not sure, but I think I've never tried it actually, but if you say it's a TIFF, it may not work quite as well, particularly if it's a multi-layered file. You can also specify an additional external editor. In this case, we've specified the Spider Checker editing application, which is a software app that's used in conjunction with the Spider Checker color chart to make camera profiles. So that's available to you also. You can specify just about any application that you want here, of course. Now, here's an eye test for you. I apologize for this. What I want to do is point out that there are a number of things that you can specify that will that can be customized when you want to export a file. Let's say you want to export your finished work, or you want to export a quick take for an art director at the end of a day. You can do any number of things. And one of the nice things about this is that it's very, very flexible. The image processor in Photoshop is nice. This is even nicer. And you can apply metadata again, and you can create this whole constellation of settings, and then you can create a preset. So instead of having to do this over and over, you have to do it once for each objective that you have in terms of exporting your images for later use. So for example, we have two batch presets here, large JPEGs to 1,000 on the long side and small JPEGs at 600 on the long side. And you can run this and then go back and run it again, and they will queue one after the other and run in the background, and you can continue to work while these create the outputs that you need. Now these presets also exist in Lightroom, so if you go down to the film strip and you right-click or Option Alt-click on a particular image or group of images, this menu will pop up. If you go to Export, and you can see your batch presets are available to you from that point forward. So you don't necessarily have to go to a big, clunky dialog box. You can simply go here and launch it, and away it goes. Now let's talk a little bit about image review and selection. You get into situations where perhaps you're shooting in the field, or you've come back after a long day and you've got a lot of raw images to look at. And I frequently think to myself, I did too much shooting, this is going to be impossible, it's going to take too long. And in some cases people have told me that it takes them just about forever to get through that folder of images or multiple folders of images. But I'll give you a few tips that may help you. What I do generally is I enlarge the film strip and I start going through the images, and I only pick out the ones that I think are a 5. Sometimes a 4 or a 5, but typically I'm picking the ones that are a 5. 5 meaning some of the best shots of the day, and typically the size of that group runs 10 to 20% of the total. So I go through and without thinking about it a lot, I look into each image and I look at the histogram, I look at the image, I decide on the score, and I go through and I give them 5s. Okay. And then there are some obvious clunkers. There are images that are out of focus. The exposure was so wrong that it's unsalvageable. I delete those. Then there are some images that I know that are going to be in the bottom of the pile. They may be usable at a later date. I'm pretty sure, 80 to 90% sure that they're not usable, but I'm not ready to delete them. I give them 1 or 2 stars. So now I have 2 groups, each representing 10 to 20% of the total, and a middle group that I call undecided. What I do is I go up to the top and I go to menu choice, which is view, and then I go to sort, and then, well, correct me, I should correct myself. The first thing I do is I select everything in the film strip. I go Command A, and then I go up to the menu, I go view, sort, and I go to rating, and all the images that have a 5, a 4, or a 5 are going to slide over to the right-hand side, and all the images that have no score are going to be on the left-hand side, followed by the images that have a score of 1. And now I know where they are and which ones to work on first. That whole exercise, even with a couple of 100 images, with a little bit of practice, takes 5 or 10 minutes. Now I'm ready to do a couple of things. I could take all the 5s and do a batch process and output rough JPEGs for an art director and get them off via email or YouSend or Dropbox, and be done with that, and then start working on some more advanced processing. So it becomes a very, very efficient workflow. Now, as far as image identification, copyright and metadata goes, there's some very powerful tools that are available in Lightroom. They are certainly better than the ones that are available in Bridge. You can see here, this is the edit metadata presets. This comes from the top menus in Lightroom. And you can see all the IPTC quadrants, but the ones that I use the most are the copyright and the keywords. And you're going to be amazed at what the keywording can do for you. The keywording can make it so much easier, for example, for you to find an image a year or 2 after you've taken it, or for a customer to find an image in a group that you've sent over. I also think it's extremely important. This copyright status here defaults to not copyright or none, and you really want it to say copyrighted. You want to put your copyright name in there, whether it's personal or your business name. Rights usage terms by written permission only. and you want to put your copyright info URL. Now, why do you want to do that? Well, of course, it's important to mark it as copyrighted, but if there's some kind of issue later on where somebody says, well, I didn't know, or I didn't know who you were, or I didn't know how to get in touch with you, sorry, it's all right there in the image. You don't have an excuse, mister. You've got a problem. You've got a problem in that you didn't pay attention. All this information is provided for you. It's right under your nose. Every image editing application in the world can read this metadata. That's the way Adobe set it up. So when you do this, you're protecting yourself. Now, this is not a substitute for registration with the Copyright Office. I'm not going to touch that one with a 10-foot pole right now. That's a day-long seminar almost. But I do embed this information in every electronic image that I create, because if it gets posted on the web, that information is in there. If it gets sent from one art director to another, that information is in there. They can find me, and they know who owns it, and they know that they're responsible for the copyright restrictions that are applicable to this image. When it says by written permission only, that means that if somebody handed it off to you, that doesn't give you permission to reproduce it in any way. It's by written permission only. So, in fact, you should say by written permission only by the copyright holder. And that's my error. I apologize for that. But in any event, if you do this, you can set this up also as a batch, and you can run this batch every time you import all of your images. Let's say you're doing wildlife images in a particular area of the country. You can put the keywords that you want in there, import them all. They've all got the keywords and the metadata in it, and you're done, finished, and you're ready to move on. Now, you can also make alterations, changes, run batches, add and delete keywords right from the Lightroom interface. I've called out a couple of panels here and enlarged them for you so you can see what the possibilities are. I'm not going to get deep down into the details of running this. I think they're pretty obvious. One of the things that does happen over here in the keywording panel that I think is as cool as could be is that as you are typing in words in here, it's going to suggest keywords to you. So as you, and believe me, it's better than the iPhone. It's not, so far it hasn't suggested any inappropriate words to me. And as you go forward, it learns from you, and it learns what words you use most often, and those come up. And you can add to your keyword set whenever you want. So you could add basic keywords on import, and then for specific images you could add keywords that are only going to be used for that image or for a couple of images. So Lightroom really gives you just the ultimate in flexibility in terms of identifying, protecting, and then later finding your images, whether they're stored on your system or someone else's system. And in fact, even if they're on the internet, this, in many cases, not all, Facebook is the most famous of these for stripping this information off. But in most cases, this information will survive being uploaded to a website. So take a deep breath, and we're going to talk about editing in Lightroom 4. Editing in Lightroom 4 is not as complicated as it looks. If you think of it as something of a blend between Adobe Camera Raw and some of the tools in Photoshop, you'll be in pretty much the right kind of space to be thinking about how this gets done. Now, here's an image before and an image after. I'm going to show you how to do that split screen in a moment. But the idea is simply that this is part of the development process. The image is moving along, et cetera, et cetera. And when you're editing in Lightroom 4, you're editing the most robust form of the image, the raw image. It has the most information, and so it makes sense, as my friend David Tobie likes to say, to stay with it, to work with it. It's the most resilient and tolerant, and it's most tolerant of changes. It's what Adobe likes to call non-destructive editing. Now, in some sense, that's a marketing term, and some people kind of disrespect that and say, well, it doesn't really mean anything. it does mean something. Adobe isn't touching the little ones and zeros that are in your image file. Adobe is actually leaving that alone and writing the instructions for image editing alongside it. And it is non-destructive editing. And in many respects, Photoshop is non-destructive editing with one exception, is that when you move from a raw processor over to Photoshop, the image has to be converted to a TIFF or a PSD file. And that is a very, very significant change in terms of the amount of information in the image, what kind of tone curve gets applied to it, etc. And so that one step is destructive, or at least image changing. Now, as you continue in Photoshop with your layer techniques and things like that, that is also what I call non-destructive editing. But it's that transfer over to Photoshop that you want to try and hold off doing that as long as you can. You want to stay in Lightroom, work on the raw image with the tools that are provided, not to the point of being ridiculous or doing workarounds that are going to take you forever, but reasonable, appropriate edits until you get to the point where you need to be in Photoshop to do what you have to do. Now, as time goes on, Adobe keeps adding tools to Lightroom. This version, Lightroom 4, is the most capable one that I've seen yet. And I'm really beginning to appreciate just what it's really capable of doing. Now, one of the things that I suggest that you do first, it's been greatly improved, I'm very impressed with this, is down at the bottom on this right-hand panel, and typically people say start at the top, look at the histogram, blah, 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 work your way to the bottom. But I would suggest, and this is actually something that David pointed out to me, is that this has been greatly improved. It never used to be that you could get the Hasselblad lens profiles in here. They weren't in here, say in Lightroom 2, and probably not even in Lightroom 3. But what happens is you can pick your camera and the model and the profile for a particular lens, and not to put too fine a point on it, one of the cameras I own is this camera. And I'm thrilled to have this finally included in here because, in particularly, the wide lens has a little bit of barreling in it, and with this profile, boom, it's gone. So I strongly suggest that you slide all the way to the bottom and pick your camera and lens for the image that you're working on, and then go back up to the top and start doing your edits. Fair enough? And then you're going to work the controls from top to bottom and consider the entire image. I normally start with exposure and white balance. We did a whole webinar not a whole webinar, but a couple of webinars on white balance. One of the great tools that we have for that is called the Spider Cube. I suggest you go to the Datacolor website and take a look at how to use the Spider Cube, both to create a custom white balance in your camera and also do white balance corrections or neutralize your images while you're in the middle of post-production. And you'd benefit greatly from that experience. There are new algorithms for some of these tools. I'm particularly impressed by the highlight and shadow and the clipping control tools. And they're named highlight and shadow and whites and blacks. But one of the things they've done is they've zeroed them in the middle so you can go minus and plus, for one thing, which is a great improvement. I'm sure a lot of the people online right now know about that. But you can also control both clipping and the intensity of whites and blacks. So if you really want to crush the shadows and the blacks, it used to be that the blacks started over here at 0 and you couldn't really do that. It was more of a shadow recovery tool. Now you can work on shadow recovery or bringing up the tones in the darker areas, or you can really crush those blacks for artistic or other purposes and really have much more control over the end result with your image. So if you had to keep a rule in mind, you know, I'm not going to go through every little tool here, but if you had to keep a rule in mind, start editing global. Think about the whole image and work on the global issues like exposure and white balance and your your ending white and black points, the end points of your dynamic range, and then work your way into the middle and down to the local level. And if you walk away from this webinar with that idea in mind, that'll be a big benefit for you. Now, of course, you've got a white balance dropper here. You want to find a neutral point. What's really nice now, you can't see it now because this is not a live view, but if you grab this eyedropper and you start moving around in the image, right underneath the histogram, you're going to see your RGB values. Very, very useful addition by Adobe. So you can find a neutral area in most images to try and set your white balance, and of course the presets and all that are available as drop-downs. And you can adjust, as per usual, the what do they call it here, temp instead of color temp, and that slider is available to you. And of course you've got your exposure, contrast, and again highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, and the clarity. And the clarity slider, although I can't prove this, seems to be a little bit more aggressive here than it used to be. So as you go forward and you start to work with some of these tools, use a light hand with the clarity slider. That's in some respects a micro contrast or fine contrast tool. You can also use it to soften images if you're working on portraits. Some people do that. But the clarity slider seems to be a little bit more aggressive to me.
Yeah, I'd address that for a second, David. There's no question that clarity is growing in popularity. It's one of the key things that people do to their images these days, and I believe, as you said, that Adobe has addressed that by giving them more latitude with that slider. This is a sharp knife and you can cut yourself with it. I don't believe that there are many images where you should actually crank that clarity slider all the way to the maximum value, unless you're trying to make your photo look like an etching, which is an artistic choice. But as David mentions, you can also move it in the other direction for soft, the kind of Vaseline on the lens type of portrait work. But again, since the range has been enhanced, you probably want to do that very carefully as well.
Yeah, I think David's right. A lot of people take clarity and use it like he said, you can cut yourself. I'll use a mixed metaphor here. It's a hammer. And I use it very gingerly. It's not a substitute for sharpening. Please keep that in mind. And vibrance isn't really a substitute for saturation. Vibrance will increase saturation in selected areas, of your color palette, but it's specifically intended to leave color tones that are close to skin tones, alone. So in a landscape image, you may get an unexpected result if you get over-enthusiastic with the vibrance slider. And again, the saturation slider is one that I very rarely touch here. I typically do saturation and color replacement and other adjustments like that in Photoshop on a layer with a layer mask so that I can control where they're applied and how much, and I can also adjust the intensity in that particular area. So there are some of the tools on here I use all the time and others that I don't. That's a personal choice, and I think it's important for you to as a photographer, I'm talking to the people in the audience right now, it's important to consider that these things have changed. Almost all of them have changed. There's a few that are the same, but I have noticed some significant differences even as they have gone through the 4.1 versions, et cetera, et cetera. And don't be afraid to experiment with them. The picture police are not going to come to your house if you do that. Get to know them before you really get serious about a project is what I would advise you to do. Now the tone curve tool, this is really a lesson in itself. Some of these features were included in some of the updates in Adobe Camera Raw, but there's some other things here that I think really can't be duplicated in Photoshop or in Camera Raw, and I want to talk about them briefly. There's whole tutorials on this available here and there. The first thing is that if you click on this little button here, this is a scrubber, and then you come over to the image and you click and hold and move up and down. It will adjust the curve up and down accordingly, and it will adjust the curve up and down at that point in the tone curve that's appropriate to the area of the image where this indicator is located. Also, when you are using this tool, you can see this faded gray area that surrounds the curve. That's showing you the complete area that's affected by that tool. That's extremely useful. It used to be that you had to practice and practice and practice with adjusting a tone curve to understand just what parts of the image would actually be affected by any movement in that line. Now Adobe is showing you that. I think that's an enormously useful educational tool, and as time goes on, you won't even see it anymore, but in the beginning in particular, having this highlighted area that's available to you as you move this scrubber around the image, testing different areas for adjustment, is very, very useful. It shows you what you're going to affect. Now, down below you have sliders that really correspond to sections of this line, this tone curve, if you would call it graph line. And the highlights obviously refer to this upper quadrant. The shadows refer to this very lower quadrant. And as before, you can, for example, take this shadow slider if you want to crush the blacks or adjust them downward and slide it to the left. These are things that we really couldn't do very well before. And you can see the impact in a graphic way here. Very, very useful for photographers, being visual people. Also, your histogram will change as you do this. So you've got two indicators here of what you're actually doing to your image while you're making these adjustments. Now, many times what I will do with an image is I will leave the highlights and shadow sliders alone. They're very close to the ends of this. And I'll move the lights and darks. I'll move the lights out a little bit, and I'll move the darks in a little bit. And that's roughly the equivalent of creating that classic S-curve. And I use that as a test on the image. It's a very easy, safe, simple way for me to kick the tires and see what the image is going to do in response to my editing. Then at that point, I can start to say, okay, I can get more aggressive, or I should be less aggressive. I should move farther out towards the ends of the tone curve, et cetera, et cetera. And there's more sophisticated parts of this that I'm not going to get into right now. These sliders here change the steepness of the curve in selected areas, and so alter the intensity of the effect that's given by these sliders. So these work in concert. And in fact, Julianne Coast has a really great tutorial on this on Adobe TV, and I'd suggest that you look it up. And it's maybe 5 minutes, and that's well worth the effort. I want to mention something else that I think is a really important tool, and you can turn this on just about any time you want to when you're working. This includes Photoshop, but in Lightroom, it's called soft proofing. And soft proofing is an archaic term. If you have a properly calibrated display, soft proofing really is your friend, because you turn it on, and you can do that by going Command S, or you can simply click on the soft proofing checkbox here, and then you come back up here, and where it says profile, you can pick the output profile that you're aiming toward. And right here it says sRGB. Obviously that would, in 99% of the cases, not be where you're going. It might be a paper. So it might be Hahnemuhle Photorag printed on an Epson 3800. Those profiles, if they're on your computer, are available to you right here. You can select that, and you will see the image change in line with the characteristics, the performance of the paper that you're going to be printing to. So it's a very, very smart tool. Now, what's the benefit of that? The benefit is if you're soft proofing from the beginning, and then you start editing your image, you know what it's going to look like when you're finished. So that's the second point today to take away, is whether you're in Photoshop or Lightroom, if you have soft proofing enabled, you're going to be able to it's almost like a crystal ball. You're going to see what's going to happen in the future. You're going to be able to know whether that image is going to work well on that particular paper or not, or whether that edit was good for that particular, output goal. Very, very, very helpful tool, but you do have to calibrate your display to take advantage of it. It's not going to work nearly as well for you if you're adjusting your display by eye. Now you've been working along in Lightroom 4. You've made your global edits. There are ways to make some selective edits in Lightroom 4. For example, there's a gradient tool that's been modified significantly so that you can include even things like sharpening in a gradient, which is really great. But there are things that you can only do in Photoshop CS6, and you want to edit in Photoshop CS6. You go to the image in your film strip, and you either option or right-click on it, and you'll see this menu come up, Edit In. Now, there's all kinds of applications that you can add to this menu, but right now we're going to talk about Edit in Photoshop CS6. Now, I'm going to go through the list, and I'm going to explain why this image looks so crazy on the right. So bear with me, please. In CS6, and this is something that I have divided feelings about. I'm not reluctant to say that I'm still working through my own workflow on this as when to move over to Photoshop, because there are things in Lightroom that they kind of overlap. On the other hand, I have really good work habits in Photoshop. I've been using that a lot longer than Lightroom. Each person is going to be a little bit different. Don't be afraid to customize your workflow, but remember that once you go to Photoshop, it's not a raw file anymore. So you give up that little bit of headroom, that editing headroom that you have, particularly in the highlights, when you go to Photoshop. Now it's going to be a PSD or a TIFF file. It's not a raw file. It may still be a big color space high bit file, but it's not a raw file. So remember that it's sort of the Rubicon of the photo world now, is you're making that transition, and it's not a one-way street, but you definitely have to leave some things behind when you do it. Now, in CS6, I think we all know at this level of expertise that there are some things that you can do here that you either can't do in Lightroom 4, or it takes a little bit of a workaround or some practice. Selective editing and color replacement is one of my favorite things to do, particularly in landscape and my commercial photography. Ask David Tobie, I change the color of things all the time. I'm ruthless and relentless and shameless about it. I like green grass to really be green, that sort of thing, and blue skies to really be blue. And I've changed the color of a model's outfit, and on and on and on. Layer masks and being able to selectively apply a special effect is one of my favorite things in Photoshop. In fact, I'm sitting here looking at my Wacom tablet, give it a little pat. It's my friend because it lets me selectively, at a very high level of detail, apply special effects and special treatments to images very efficiently. There's no such thing as content-aware fill in Lightroom unless I'm just totally off base. The transform and distort tools, again, in my commercial photography, whether I'm shooting architecture or shooting machinery or things like that, I really do use those transform and distort tools to correct perspective issues, to composite things together. The liquefy and the liquefy tool is, a tool for good or evil. Everybody knows that, but it does come in handy. Head swaps. We all know the jokes about that. Compositing, some filters and plugins, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole raft of things in Photoshop that are available to you that are not yet, anyway, available in Lightroom. I suspect as time goes on that we'll see more and more of these things in Lightroom. That certainly has been the history so far. Then, when you're done, you're going to save that file. Don't go and keep all your layers. You don't have to flatten it. You can keep your channels, all of it, but don't go File, Save As. That will flatten the image. You want to keep your layers. What you want to do is simply go File, Save, and Photoshop will take that file and save it and drop it right into the folder where your original RAW came from, right next to it. And the file name will change. It will be file name, whatever your convention is, whether it's the camera number or the job number or the client number. It will say -edit.psd. Remember we said that those files were going to be PSDs from now on, way back at the beginning of this when we put our preferences together. And it's no longer a raw file. Again, it may be a big color palette. It may be a 16-bit file. That's all well and good, and it makes it easier to work on, but it's not a raw file. So just keep that in mind. Your original raw file is intact. It's still there. It's still alive and well and happy and waiting for you to come back to it. But that PSD file is now a separate entity. Now, if you go right-click or Option-Alt-click and go Edit In, it will open in Photoshop. The first thing you'll see is a dialog. It'll have 3 choices on it. One of them is open it without changing it, and it will open in Photoshop with all your layers intact. That's pretty cool. So you can go over to Lightroom, do your thing, go back. Now, I just saw a question about virtual copies. That's almost a subject unto itself, but virtual copies are particularly useful if you want to compare versions. If you want to prepare images for different output devices, you can make as many virtual copies as you want. You can edit them as though they were regular files, and then you can test them either in your print device, or you can test them on screen, or you can output them as JPEGs to send to an art director. It's a very useful tool. It's one of the ways to describe this is it's a little bit like the old version of layer comps on steroids, where you could create 4 or 5 different versions of an image and activate or inactivate a certain set, a certain group, or a certain layer comp, and then generate a test file for somebody. Well, here in Lightroom, you can create virtual copies and do that, and it's much faster and easier, and again, you're working on a raw file. So I hope that answers the questions about virtual copies. Now, get back to the screen. I put this in kind of as a joke. I took a snapshot of a building in Denver. I obviously was tilting. I'm famous for doing this without a tripod, if I'm shooting without a tripod. So the whole building is out of whack. That camera is about as far out of whack as it can get and still take a picture. And I popped it into Photoshop very briefly, and I used Edit, Transform, Distort, and I just pulled this corner out to straighten it a bit to show you that there are, although you can do some of the things that you need to do in Lightroom, there are times where Photoshop is your friend and you need to go over there and to get the job done. Now, as far as printing goes, you can't beat Lightroom for printing. Now, if you're printing one image at a time and you're not a big fan of presets and you're not doing batch printing, Photoshop is your friend. It's easy to use. It's pretty darn fast. It does a good job. But if you're in, for example, the event or wedding business, or if you're creating sets of comps for an art director, etc., anytime you want to print multiple images, for example, they have all of these templates available here. And let's just see. I think I've got this on a second slide here. Yes, I do. This is not easy to do in Photoshop. Photoshop has a plugin that you can use to put different images or the same images on a piece of paper, etc. But it's not that easy to use. This is much easier to use. You highlight the images you want to use, you click on the template, and voila. And here we are getting into what's called, what I call RIP territory, where it used to be to get this kind of functionality, you would have to spend $500 to $1,000 on a RIP. Well, a lot of those features are now incorporated into Photoshop, which includes things like adding print sharpening. You can adjust the images in some ways. There are so many tools in here in terms of layouts and guides and managing your print job that I strongly urge you to explore this. If you don't have Lightroom, by the way, you can download it as a 30-day free trial from the Adobe website. And really look into this, because this is one of the strong features. A lot of people say, oh, Lightroom is only good for cataloging, etc. Well, I think it's great for setting up the image for cataloging and tracking and copyright protection and image editing and printing. And a lot of the tools they've added to it make it a very, very useful tool. And as time has gone on, particularly in the last couple of months, I'm moving more and more towards the majority of my workflow being in Lightroom, going to Photoshop when I need to, and then coming back to Lightroom for final output. You can create books. I believe you can even output images and burn them directly to a CD. So, but the thing that really gets me going here is all these templates, all these things. This is like 10 times more than you could ever have gotten from Photoshop without buying somebody's plugin or something like that. And you can do layouts and composites, triptychs, all kinds of things on here that that can really serve you well, particularly if you have a printer that will take larger sheets or takes roll paper. You can really save a lot of money doing this because you can print proofs. You can gang them up on say a 13 by 19 sheet or 11 by 14 sheet, or you can print them the long way on a roll of paper and not waste any paper on the ends, which is something I've been doing lately. So it's a very, very useful tool. It has all the same features as Photoshop does in terms of you can use printer managed color, but what I do recommend is you use application managed color and a printer profile. And if it's not identical, it's 99% the same engine that processes software algorithm, same software engine that processes your image and sends it to the printer and manages the print job for you. So you can see that the way that this works now, it's not a, if you forgive the phrase, a black and white situation. It's a situation where Lightroom keeps improving. It's almost a moving target, and so does Photoshop CS6, probably soon to be CS7, et cetera, et cetera. But what is important to note is that Lightroom has really stepped up onto the big stage and offers you tools that let you work on your raw files, which are more robust, up to a point, and you have to decide what that point is. Then you transition over to Photoshop, and then when it's time, you can come back to Lightroom to finish the job. And I think that pretty much covers it for today. It's a lot of material to cover. There's far more that we could talk about in terms of the mechanics of operating the software. I hope this helped you, and I hope that you'll come back again for other webinars that we'll be offering later in the year. We do 2 a month. My partner David Tobie and I enjoyed doing this quite a bit. And let's see here. We've got, we should have a couple of winners.
Well, while you're finding them, I'll state that this was a very interactive crowd, and I could not keep up with the questions being asked. I've spent the last hour typing madly, and I have to apologize for those of you towards the bottom of the list who asked later questions that I was unable to answer. But I've enjoyed answering the ones that I did cover.
One thing I'll mention is that I'm perfectly happy to answer questions via email. You can see on this last slide, it says dsaffir@mac.com. Teaching's a big part of what I do. My students are all welcome to send me emails. I'll warn you, I do get a lot. And if I don't answer you in 24 hours, please do resend your email to me. It just means that I missed it. I'm not ignoring you. It just means that it went by in the avalanche. And we have one winner here for both prizes, Ken Aiken. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Patricia will be getting in touch with you via email to get your contact information and to arrange for delivery of your goods.
Well, congratulations, and
Yeah,
thank you, David, for a great webinar. I was pleased to hear so much of what we've discussed over the last few days on this topic, so nicely covered in your presentation here.
Thank you. Also, there's discounts from Datacolor, 20% discount on all Datacolor products purchased at datacolor.com. The promo code is workflow20, and it's valid through the 20th. And at the SLR Lounge, 25% off all products at slrlounge.com. The promo code is Datacolor 25, and valid from today through the 1st. So take advantage of those. I appreciate everybody attending. We had a really great crowd today, a lot of people. I encourage you to come back. We got a lot more material on a range of subjects coming up later this year. Thanks very much, and hope to see you soon.
I will point out that our next webinar is, if you look, I believe, is on floral photography, but don't be deceived. We use that as a mechanism for teaching photo aesthetics and photo technology like we would with any other topic. So hope that some of you will attend that, even if you're not floral photographers, because the concepts there are what we're really after. So
Yeah, that's
thank
a
you all
really
for
good
attending.
point. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.